The year was 1903, and the village was preparing for a celebration that should have been remembered as a day of joy. The cobbled streets were lined with banners, tables were stacked with bread and roasted meats, and children rehearsed dances to the sound of fiddles and drums. It was to be a festival of light, of music, of life. Yet, the echoes of that day would never carry forward. What should have been laughter became silence, and what should have been remembered as joy became a shadow carved into dark history. At first glance, the festival was ordinary. Families posed for photographs, women wore their best dresses, and children clutched ribbons in their small hands. An old photograph from that morning still survives, its edges curled, its surface faded. At a distance it seems harmless, a relic of forgotten times. But look closely at the image, and the shadows do not fit. One boy's face is blurred beyond recognition, his body sharp yet his eyes clouded. A hand appears behind a woman's shoulder, though no one stands there. The details seem subtle, yet the longer you stare, the more the photograph resists your gaze. The villagers smiled for the camera, but many of those faces would never be seen again. By the following week, entire families had vanished. Some houses stood empty, meals still on the tables, clothes still laid out as if their owners would return. They never did. And the festival that was meant to unite the village ended instead in silence, a silence that spread across the years like a curse. Historians describe the village as one of those strange families of places, cut off from the modern world. Its people carried old traditions, and with them, whispers of a forbidden language spoken only in hushed tones. Outsiders were not welcome. Travelers wrote in journals about eerie details they noticed. The children who avoided sunlight, the families who refused to be painted, the priest who preached sermons no one could translate. Even before 1903, the place seemed suspended in time, unwilling to move forward. That festival was meant to open the village to the world. For the first time, a traveling photographer had been invited. His camera captured images of the crowd, of children smiling, of women clutching parasols. But many of these photographs were later destroyed, burned by surviving relatives who claimed they were disturbing images, not of life, but of death. Some said they resembled post-mortem photography, with glassy eyes and rigid expressions. Others claimed that when the plates developed, new faces appeared among the villagers, faces no one recognized. The photographer himself left behind only one account. In a letter, he described the sensation of cold hands on his shoulders as he focused his lens. He heard whispers in the air, a murmur like a prayer in that forbidden language. He wrote of shadows that moved where no light fell. He never sent another letter. Within days, he too disappeared, leaving only fragments of his equipment behind. The mystery of that day has haunted historians and folklorists for more than a century. Was it a mass disappearance? A curse? A tragedy buried by time? Or something stranger, an event that does not fit into history as we know it? The unsettling history of the village has been pieced together only from fragments, forgotten events retold in fireside whispers, old photos kept locked away, and a silence that still feels alive. When the church bell rang to begin the festivities, villagers cheered, children clapped, and music rose into the air. But in the old photograph of that moment, taken just before everything changed, there is one chilling secret. A figure stands at the very edge of the crowd. His face is obscured, his clothing unfamiliar. No one recalls his presence, no record lists his name. And yet, there he is, captured forever in that single frame, staring directly at the camera as if he knew how the day would end. This was no ordinary festival. It was the beginning of an unsolved mystery, a disturbing story etched into the sinister past of a village now lost in time. The celebration began with laughter, but by nightfall, all that remained was silence. The year was 1903, and the village seemed ordinary at first glance. A cluster of stone cottages, a narrow road winding through the hills, and fields stretching out beneath an endless sky. To the casual traveler, it looked peaceful, even charming. But behind the quiet streets and painted shutters, the place carried a sinister past. Every family, every child, every brick of the church was layered with secrets. This was not a village eager for outsiders. Its people were bound together like a strange family, protective and insular. They lived by old traditions, older than the church that cast its shadow across the square. Locals whispered in a forbidden language, half remembered from centuries past, a tongue never written down, but spoken in dark corners where outsiders could not hear. Children grew up learning to recite chants that no one beyond the hills could understand. It was a language of warnings, of curses, of promises made long before 1903. Visitors often spoke of an unease that settled over them the moment they entered the village. Travelers' diaries describe doors shutting as they walked by, faces peering through curtains, and children who stared too long with dark, unblinking eyes. The silence of the place was unlike any other. Even when the streets were full, laughter felt hollow, as if rehearsed. The square, where the festival would soon unfold, had already earned a reputation among nearby towns. They called it haunted ground. Old photos that survive from earlier years reveal eerie details. Families posed stiffly for the camera, but something always seemed wrong. Shadows bent in unnatural ways. Eyes appeared to follow the viewer. In one photograph of a baptism, the child's face looks aged, wrinkled like an old man. Some believed these images were mistakes of exposure. Others insisted they were disturbing images of hidden truth, proof that the village was never what it seemed. Local folklore whispered of vanished children. Over decades, families claimed sons and daughters had simply disappeared. They would be put to bed at night, and by morning their rooms were empty. No footprints, no struggle, no sign of escape. Just absence. Entire family lines faded from record, leaving behind abandoned houses where meals still sat on tables and toys remained scattered across floors. These were not ordinary disappearances. They were unsolved mysteries buried beneath silence. Yet, the villagers continued their lives as though nothing had happened. They tended their fields, rang their church bell, and carried on the festival each year as tradition demanded. Outsiders found this chilling, the way dark history was ignored, the way unsettling history was woven into celebration. The festival was not merely a gathering. It was an offering, a ritual meant to keep something at bay. What that something was, no one could say. Rumors spread of a hidden truth. Some believed the village had struck a bargain with the land itself, a pact to protect them from famine or plague in exchange for silence. Others said the villagers were cursed, bound forever to repeat rituals they no longer understood. What could not be explained was simply passed down through the generations. The festival must continue, the dances must be performed, and the photographs must be taken. To break the cycle, they feared, would awaken what slept beneath the surface. The church stood at the heart of these whispers. Its walls were older than the village itself, built on ruins no one dared to name. Carvings on the stone showed strange figures, half human, half animal, their eyes wide and mouths open in eternal cries. These carvings were said to be warnings, but the priest assured the villagers they were symbols of protection. Whether protection or curse, no one outside the village could ever be certain. In this setting, the festival of 1903 was prepared. Outsiders believed it was simply a harvest celebration, a quaint display of rural life. But those who lived in the village knew better. The square was not just a place for dancing and music. It was sacred ground, a place where past and present merged. The rituals were older than the people who carried them out, and the cost of breaking them was whispered in the vanished faces of children and the abandoned homes left behind. It is here, in this village bound by secrecy, haunted by its sinister past, that the story of 1903 begins to darken. The festival was not simply a moment of joy. It was a test, one that had been passed down through forgotten events, forbidden language, and chilling secrets that outsiders were never meant to hear. And as the banners rose and the first preparations began, the villagers knew what outsiders could not, that the square had a hunger of its own. The year was 1903, and as the festival drew near, the village stirred with nervous energy. On the surface, it was preparation for joy, ribbons hung across doorways, food laid out in baskets, children rehearsing their dances in the square. But beneath the laughter was something heavier, something unspoken. Every villager knew that this was not just celebration. It was obligation. Families worked late into the night. Women sewed costumes by candlelight, their needles glinting like thin silver blades. Men raised wooden poles in the square, fixing banners that swayed in the wind like watchful eyes. The children, the ones who still remained, learned steps that had been passed down for generations. The dances had meaning, though no one could explain why. They simply knew the rhythm must be kept, or the silence would return. Strange things began to happen in those days. Livestock refused to eat. Dogs howled through the night, staring into the woods as though something moved just beyond sight. One woman was seen crying at dawn, clutching a small shoe in her hands, though no child in her home was missing. Neighbors whispered, but no one asked her questions. In the village, grief was never spoken aloud. It lingered in silence. A photographer, newly arrived, wrote of the preparations in his journal. He noted how the villagers smiled when he asked for portraits, but their smiles never reached their eyes. He described eerie details in his developing plates. Blurred outlines where there should have been faces, streaks of light bending unnaturally, shadows that seemed too heavy for the daylight. He wondered if his equipment was failing, or if the village itself was pressing into his work. Old photographs from earlier festivals show the same unsettling history. In one, a group of children stand hand in hand, but if you count them closely, the numbers never add up. A small figure appears in the background, a child, faceless, watching. In another, a family poses at their table, but one of the women appears twice, once standing and once seated, her eyes black and hollow. These disturbing images were kept locked away, hidden from outsiders, for fear that too many eyes upon them would awaken something best left unseen. As the day of the festival approached, the villagers spoke less and less. The forbidden language slipped into their prayers, carried in murmurs through the night. Outsiders could not understand the words, but the sound itself was unsettling, sharp, guttural, almost like the cry of an animal. It was said that these chants were not for protection, but for remembrance. That the village was remembering something too dangerous to forget. Children played their roles carefully, though they seemed distant, as if rehearsing for something larger than themselves. Some clutched dolls that looked too lifelike, almost like post-mortem photography, figures with glassy eyes, dressed in funeral clothes. These dolls were said to represent those who had vanished before. A reminder, carried into the dance, that the festival must never be broken. The woods surrounding the village seemed alive with watchers. Several villagers reported seeing a figure standing between the trees at dusk, tall, pale, unmoving. Always too far away to identify, yet close enough to be seen. Children pointed, but when adults looked, nothing was there. The figure became a shadow in every whispered conversation. No one admitted to knowing who or what it was. Food was prepared in strange abundance. More bread, more meat, more wine than the population could possibly consume. Outsiders noted this, but the villagers offered no explanation. It was as though they expected guests. Guests no one would name. By the final evening, the village seemed to hold its breath. Every window was lit by candlelight, every door locked from the inside. In the square, the banners creaked in the wind, the stage stood empty, and the instruments waited in silence. The photographer noted in his journal that the air felt heavy, charged, as though the sky itself was pressing down upon the roofs. The festival was almost ready. Yet something about the preparations felt wrong. Too careful, too fearful. As if the people were not preparing for celebration at all, but for survival. The year was 1903, and at last, the day of the festival arrived. The church bell rang across the valley, its iron voice echoing through the hills. Families poured into the square, dressed in their finest clothes. Children carried ribbons, musicians tuned their instruments, and the photographer prepared his camera for the first group portrait. To anyone passing through, it might have looked like an ordinary gathering, but those who lived there knew the square was more than stone and soil. It was a place bound to silence, a place where joy was always watched by something unseen. At first glance, everything appeared normal. Women arranged tables stacked with bread and steaming pots of stew. Men shared flasks and laughter. Children ran in circles, their shoes tapping against the cobbles. But beneath the noise, there was a tension in the air, a waiting. The villagers smiled, yet their eyes flickered nervously to the woods. Even in the heat of the summer sun, many swore they felt a chill move across their skin, as if a shadow had passed unseen. The photographer set his tripod in the middle of the square. He invited families to pose, arranging them carefully against the backdrop of banners and flowers. The first photograph was taken, a bright flash, the sharp crack of chemistry, and the brief blindness of light. When the smoke cleared, several children were no longer laughing. They stared at the camera with glassy eyes, their expressions too solemn for such a day. Later, when the play developed, witnesses would claim there were faces behind them, blurred figures, watching from the edges. Music began. The fiddlers played a tune that had been carried down for generations, its notes rising high, then plunging low. The sound was cheerful, yet strangely haunting. Outsiders described it as a lullaby turned wrong, a melody that seemed to know too much of sorrow. The dancers moved in practiced steps, children circling hand in hand. But midway through the dance, a little girl stumbled. She pointed toward the edge of the crowd. Her mother rushed to her side, yet the child whispered only one word, "He's here." Witnesses later disagreed on what she had seen. Some claimed there was a man standing near the church wall, taller than the others, his face hidden beneath a wide hat. Others swore there was nothing at all. The photograph taken at that moment reveals something else, a shadow that stretches too far, too long, cutting across the cobblestones like a dark scar. Food was served, yet many did not eat. The plates were piled high, but villagers left them untouched, glancing toward the woods as though waiting for someone else to arrive. The children grew restless, their play subdued. Several clutched their dolls tightly, dolls that resembled post-mortem photography, stiff, glass-eyed, dressed in miniature funeral clothes. It was said these dolls were never to be dropped. They were reminders, symbols of those who had vanished before. The photographer captured another group portrait. This one showed a band of musicians. At first glance, it looks ordinary. But look closely, and you will see one man's eyes staring too directly into the lens, wide, unblinking, his expression frozen in something between a smile and a scream. In the corner of the frame, a child appears twice, standing on opposite sides of the group, identical in every detail. Disturbing images, yet the villagers did not react. They pretended not to notice. Pretending was safer. By afternoon, the festival was in full swing. Laughter echoed, though it felt rehearsed, hollow. The music swelled, and children spun in circles until their faces blurred. But those who later recalled the day spoke of something else. The way the air grew heavy, the way sound seemed to thin, as though something vast and unseen had begun to press down on the village. And then came the moment no one would ever forget. The fiddles reached their highest note, sharp and shrill. A drumbeat shook the air, and in that instant, a violin string snapped with a scream-like cry, cutting through the festival like a blade. The dancers froze. The laughter stopped, and silence began to spread. The year was 1903, and as the silence crept across the square, the photographer lifted his camera one final time. He did not know why. Perhaps it was instinct. Perhaps it was fear. Perhaps he felt that what was unfolding had to be preserved, proof of a moment too strange to be believed. He focused his lens on the crowd, unaware that he was about to capture the most disturbing image of his life. At first glance, the photograph appears like any other from that day. Families gathered together, children clutching their dolls, musicians holding their instruments. Yet there is something different in their expressions. Their smiles have vanished. Their faces are tense, hollow, drained of life. Some look beyond the lens, as though watching something approach from behind. Others stare directly at the camera, their eyes wide and glassy, unblinking. Look closely at the edges of the image. There, in the shadow of the church wall, stands a figure, tall, unfamiliar, his face blurred, his clothing indistinct. He does not belong to the village. Of that, all who studied the photograph later were certain. And yet, he is there, standing still, his gaze fixed on the lens as though he knew the camera would preserve him forever. The anomalies do not end there. A child appears twice in the frame, his body duplicated on opposite sides of the group. A woman's hand rests on her daughter's shoulder, but the fingers are too long, stretching unnaturally, curling like claws. One man's face is missing altogether, a blank smear where features should be, as if the photograph itself had refused to remember him. These eerie details were dismissed by some as accidents of exposure, but to others, they were hidden truths bleeding into the image. Historians who later examined the plate called it one of the most disturbing images in the archives of forgotten events. It was not simply a photograph. It was evidence that something unnatural had stepped into the frame. The photographer, shaken, tried to steady his equipment. In his journal, found years later, he wrote of what he felt in that moment. A sudden weight pressing down on his shoulders, as if invisible hands were holding him in place. He described whispers in a forbidden language circling the air around him, words he could not understand but could not forget, words that seemed to echo even after the voices fell silent. When he looked up from his camera, he noticed something strange. Several children were no longer moving. Their dolls hung limply from their hands. Their eyes seemed glazed, as though they were frozen in place. Parents whispered their names, but the children did not respond. They stood like statues, caught between breath and silence. The villagers pretended nothing was wrong. They forced smiles, urged the musicians to continue, though the music was broken and discordant. One man lifted his violin, but no sound came when the bow touched the string. Only silence. A silence so complete it felt unnatural, as though the world itself had stopped listening. Later accounts claim that when the photograph was developed, more figures appeared than had stood in the square. Dark shapes lingered in the background, faces without features, shadows without bodies. Some swore they saw children who had been missing for decades, standing silently among the living. Others claimed to see their own reflections, staring back with expressions of grief and terror. The photograph became infamous. It was the last image ever taken of the festival. The photographer himself vanished within days, his notes ending abruptly. His camera was found abandoned near the village well, its lens cracked, as if shattered from within. The villagers destroyed most of the other plates, burning them in the square that same night. Only fragments survived, warped, blackened, the images within barely visible. But those who saw the final photograph, before it disappeared into archives, never forgot it. Some described it as post-mortem photography of the entire village, a portrait not of life, but of death caught in mid-breath. To this day, no one agrees on what the photograph truly shows. Was it a trick of the light? A flaw in the developing process? Or was it proof of something far darker, something hidden within the festival, something that had always been waiting to be revealed? One thing is certain. The moment that final photograph was taken, the festival began to unravel. The silence deepened. The smiles faded. And the villagers knew that whatever bargain they had once made, it was about to be broken. The year was 1903, and in the square, the silence thickened. What had begun as music and laughter now felt staged, fragile, ready to collapse at any moment. The villagers shifted uneasily, their eyes darting from the church to the woods, as though waiting for something to reveal itself. The air was heavy, pressing down, and even the summer sun seemed dim, shrouded in a veil no one could name. Then it happened. The violin string snapped. The sound tore through the square like a scream, sharp, shrill, unnatural. Dancers froze mid-step, their hands locked together, their feet suspended in unfinished movement. The music faltered, stopped. A hush fell across the crowd, but it was not ordinary silence. It was deeper. A silence that swallowed sound. Birds no longer sang. The wind no longer stirred the banners. It was as if the world itself had forgotten how to breathe. Several villagers described a moment of confusion, followed by terror. A child collapsed in the middle of the square, her doll slipping from her hand. When her mother rushed forward, She found the girl's eyes open, staring blankly at the sky, lips moving in a forbidden language she could not have known. The words were guttural, ancient, echoing across the cobblestones like a chant. Others in the crowd began to hear the same whispers, though no one could say from where. The photographer felt it most. In his journal, the final pages before his disappearance, he wrote that the ground seemed to pulse beneath his feet. He described it as a heartbeat, slow and steady, thudding beneath the stone square. He swore that the earth itself was alive, waiting, listening. He raised his camera again, though his hands shook violently. What he captured in that instant, no one would ever see. The plate was shattered before it could be developed, as though the image resisted being preserved. Witnesses claimed shadows began to lengthen, stretching far beyond their natural reach. A man standing near the fountain turned suddenly pale, his shadow bending away from him, moving independently across the stones. People gasped, but no one dared speak. The silence had become something alive, something oppressive, every word swallowed, every breath stolen. Then came the whispers. At first faint, like wind curling through the trees, then louder, circling the square, overlapping, echoing. They carried in the forbidden language of the village, though no mouth moved to form them. The sound pressed into the villagers' ears, burrowed into their minds, twisting their thoughts. Some fell to their knees, clutching their heads. Others stood motionless, eyes wide, lips trembling without words. Parents clutched their children, but several children seemed already lost. Their small voices joined the whispers, reciting chants no outsider could translate. Their eyes rolled back, their faces pale. To those who later survived, this was the most chilling secret of all. The children were not afraid. They welcomed it. One man tried to flee. He turned toward the road leading out of the square. But before he reached the edge, he stopped. His body froze mid-stride, one foot in the air, his face twisted in panic. He never moved again. When others rushed to him, they found only a shell. His body was there, but he was gone. Historians who studied the event called it the unraveling, the moment the festival shifted from celebration to mystery, from forgotten event to unsolved tragedy. The silence was not absence. It was presence. Something had entered the square, something vast and unseen, and the people knew they were no longer alone. The photographer's final words capture the horror best. The air thickens. The faces blur. The silence speaks. We are not meant to be here. And yet they remained. Trapped in a village square that no longer belonged to them. The festival was broken. The turning point had come, and what followed would never be forgotten. The year was 1903, and in the village square, time itself seemed to falter. The festival no longer belonged to the living. The air was heavy with silence, a silence that pressed against every chest, choking breath, stealing words. And then they began to vanish. At first, it was subtle. A child holding her father's hand simply wasn't there anymore. No cry, no struggle, no sound. One moment she clutched his sleeve, the next his fingers grasped only air. The man's scream tore through the square, shattering the hush. But when he looked down, his shadow stretched long and empty, no smaller figure beside him. Families dissolved in fragments. A mother turned to lift her child into her arms, but the child was gone, the doll she carried still lying in the dirt where she had stood. Another family clutched each other desperately, only to find themselves holding onto garments, shoes, or nothing at all. It was as if the square itself devoured its own people, swallowing them into the unseen. The photographer, who still lingered near the fountain, described it in words few dared to read later. He wrote that the air shimmered, bending like heat on stone, and where the shimmer passed, people disappeared. No trace. No explanation. Just absence. He swore he heard the whispers grow louder each time a body vanished, as though something beneath the square fed on the souls taken. Some vanished mid-motion, their final gestures frozen in the minds of those who watched. A woman dancing, skirt swirling, suddenly gone, her movement unfinished, her shoes left behind. A boy chasing after a rolling ball, disappearing before it touched his hands. A priest lifting his hand to make the sign of the cross, swallowed before his blessing was complete. But it was not only people. The festival itself unraveled. Tables collapsed though no one touched them. Food rotted in an instant, turning black, crawling with flies. The banners that had hung so proudly now drooped, frayed, as if decades had passed in seconds. The music sheets scattered by the musicians bore words no one had written, scratched lines of forbidden language etched across the paper. And then came the photographs. Witnesses claimed the photographer raised his camera one last time, capturing the horror of the vanishing. But when he lowered the device, the people in front of him were already gone, leaving the square nearly empty. The plates later found in his ruined satchel bore nothing but streaks of shadow, distorted shapes that resembled faces, hands reaching outward, and eyes staring back. Disturbing images no one could explain, images that became evidence of a sinister past. By dusk, the village square was no longer a festival. It was an abandoned stage, littered with remnants, clothing, toys, overturned chairs. But the people were gone. Entire families had vanished, erased as though they had never lived. Only a handful remained, trembling, too afraid to move, too afraid to speak of what they had seen. What unsettled historians most was what came after. The survivors, broken and silent, refused to discuss the vanished. They lived in the village for years, but not one dared speak of the festival again. Their children grew up in haunted silence, forbidden from asking questions. The event became a ghost, a forgotten piece of dark history buried under shame and fear. But those who later unearthed the story agreed on one thing. The vanishing was not death. It was something worse. Death leaves a body, a trace, a record. This left nothing. Only silence. Only absence. And silence can be more terrifying than death. The year was 1903, and the village that once held its proudest festival now lay under a shadow no sun could disperse. The silence lingered long after the music had stopped. The survivors spoke little, their faces pale, their eyes fixed downward. They had seen too much. And what they had seen, they knew, could never be spoken of aloud. But silence nevertheless. It rots, it festers, and it draws the curious. Within weeks, outsiders arrived, priests, journalists, investigators from nearby towns. Each came with their own reason. Faith, duty, greed, or the lure of a story too strange to resist. What they found was not merely a tragedy. It was something darker, something hidden within the very stones of the square. The survivors were reluctant. They whispered only at night, in hushed voices, as though even the wind might be listening. They spoke of shadows that moved without their owners, of children chanting in a forbidden language, of the vanishing that left no bodies behind, only disturbing remnants, a doll's cracked porcelain face, a priest's crucifix bent out of shape, a woman's dress shredded as though she had been pulled violently from existence. These whispers were not testimonies. They were warnings. One investigator described the square as haunted without ghosts. He claimed the silence remained unnatural, oppressive, heavy on the chest. His journal noted that even animals refused to cross it. Birds circled above but never landed. Dogs whimpered and pulled their leashes away. The fountain at the center no longer flowed with clean water. Instead, the basin was coated with a dark residue that no villager dared touch. Photographs became central to the investigation. The ruined plates from the village photographer were collected and examined under lamplight. What they revealed unsettled even the most hardened men. The images were warped, as though light itself had been bent unnaturally. In the smudges of shadow, one could almost see faces, elongated, hollow-eyed, mouths open in silent screams. In one, a child's hand seemed to reach outward from the dark, fingers long and thin, grasping at something unseen. These disturbing images were never published. Officials feared they would spread panic. Instead, they were locked away, lost in archives, whispered about by archivists too frightened to look at them for long. The priests who came to cleanse the square performed rites and prayers in Latin, but their voices faltered. Witnesses recalled that the air thickened each time a prayer was spoken, the words swallowed before they reached heaven. One priest was said to have fainted mid-rite, whispering before he lost consciousness. It understands us. It listens. The villagers themselves refused to participate. When pressed, they said little, but their silence told its own story. Outsiders noticed that families who had lost children placed small objects at the edge of the square, toys, shoes, scraps of clothing, as if making offerings to something still present. Some swore they heard faint giggles at night, children's voices echoing faintly through the streets, though no children remained. Whispers spread beyond the village. Neighboring towns spoke of a cursed place, a festival that should never have been held, an ancient punishment resurfacing from a sinister past. Scholars debated whether the villagers had uncovered something forbidden, a ritual, an old pact broken, a hidden truth better left buried. Yet, despite their efforts, the investigators found nothing concrete. No bodies, no physical evidence beyond the photographs, no explanation for the vanishings. Official reports concluded that hysteria had gripped the community, that families had fled into the woods, never to be found. But those who walked the square at night, those who heard the whispers in the air, knew the truth was far more terrifying. The silence was not absence. It was presence. And whatever had taken the villagers was still there, waiting, patient. The year was 1903, and though the square stood empty, the village itself was never free again. The festival had ended in silence, but its echoes carried forward, staining generations with whispers they could never outrun. What remained was not just grief, it was a curse. A legacy written in shadows. The survivors who stayed behind grew old in silence. They refused to speak of the vanished. Children born afterward grew up under strict orders. Do not enter the square after dusk. Do not play the music of that day. Do not speak of what happened. But children are curious. And curiosity keeps curses alive. Some found the photographer's shattered satchel buried near the fountain. Inside were broken glass plates and torn notes, the final fragments of a man who had witnessed too much. The notes spoke of a language beneath the earth, of voices rising from the stones, of faces in the shadows that had no bodies. He warned that what happened in the square was not an accident, not a haunting, but a continuation. Something ancient had been awakened, and once called, it would not return to sleep. Strange families began leaving the village. Those who remained grew more insular, guarding their secrets. Outsiders whispered that the villagers were marked, that their blood carried a stain. And in time, the rumors spread further. Nearby towns reported seeing unfamiliar figures standing at the edges of forests, silent, pale, eyes unblinking. Some swore these were the vanished children, still young, still waiting. Others claimed they were shadows masquerading as people, reminders of a sinister past that refused to fade. Records uncovered decades later deepened the mystery. In old church ledgers, investigators found cryptic notes about earlier festivals, notes dating back centuries. Descriptions of celebrations that ended in silence, of voices that should not be spoken, of children lost but never dead. The cycle repeated. Every few generations, the village square bore witness to vanishings. The festival had always been cursed. The people had simply tried to forget, and yet the forgetting became part of the curse. For every silence, there was a record, hidden in margins, buried in archives, scribbled in forbidden language that few dared translate. Those who did translate found words that chilled them. They take what is given. They keep what is theirs. They return for the rest. By the early 20th century, the story of the vanished festival faded into a ghost of memory, told only in hushed warnings to children. The square remained, but no celebrations ever took place there again. Weeds grew between the stones. The fountain dried up. The silence became permanent, like a scar across the heart of the village. But the curse lingered. Some families reported children waking at night, speaking in voices not their own, whispering names of the vanished. Others found disturbing images scrawled on walls, crude drawings of the festival, shadows bending, hands reaching from the ground. These signs came and went, but each served as a reminder. The silence was never broken. It simply waited. Dark history is never truly lost. It clings, it seeps, it poisons what comes after. And this village, this square, became more than a tragedy. It became a warning, a cursed legacy, passed from one generation to the next, etched not only into memory, but into the very stones themselves. And as with all curses, the most chilling truth is this: it does not stay where it began. The year was 1903, and a village festival that should have been a celebration ended in silence forever. What began as music and laughter unraveled into vanishing whispers and shadows that left no trace. Families gone, children lost, photographs shattered. What remained was not grief alone, but something worse: absence. For years afterward, the village carried its curse quietly. Outsiders wrote it off as hysteria, as rumor, as superstition, but those who stood in the square after nightfall felt it. The weight, the stillness, the sense that something beneath the stones still stirred, patient, listening. Dark history never truly dies. It lingers, feeding on silence. Old photographs, tucked away in forgotten archives, whisper their own warnings. Distorted faces, hollow eyes, children frozen in eerie poses that should not exist. Disturbing images no one dares display. Historians call them evidence. Villagers call them reminders. To those who have seen them, they are something else entirely, proof of a mystery the world refuses to face. The cursed legacy of the 1903 festival lives on, etched into the memory of a place too afraid to speak its truth. Families vanished, but their absence echoes. Survivors aged, but their silence told more than words. Even now, the square remains abandoned, the fountain dry, the stones cracked and lifeless. Locals avoid it. Strangers feel unwelcome. The silence remains. Perhaps the most unsettling truth is this: silence spreads. It moves with the whispers, with the photographs, with those who carry the memory forward. Some who have studied the event claim to hear faint voices in their sleep. Others swear that the photographs change when looked at too long, shadows shifting, eyes following, lips parting to form words no human tongue should speak. And so the story is not over. It never was. The festival of 1903 was not the first time, and it will not be the last. The silence waits, and if you listen closely enough you may hear it waiting for you. This was the story of a village festival from 1903 that ended in silence forever. But silence has a way of returning. It has a way of finding you. Thank you for watching. If you dare to sleep after this,